Today's topic is rational belief. So another way to think about rational belief is rational belief concerns the question, what should we believe? And when we're thinking about critical thinking, thinking critically has a number of advantages. It helps us state arguments and positions more clearly, see both sides of a debate rather than just kind of coming at it from some previously held opinion that we had. And it helps us improve our discourse and writing. It helps us speak more clearly and write more clearly and just be a better discussant or debater. But one of the most important things that critical thinking enables us to do is answer the question, what should I believe? And a lot of these things from the previous list are relevant to that. So if we can see both sides of the debate, it helps us better see, well, which side is right. It helps us better evaluate that. If we can state an argument or a position more clearly, then again, it helps us say, should I believe the conclusion of this argument? Or is this position plausible? Is this the most likely to be true version of the position? Helps us be charitable. But again, this sort of leads us to this question, what beliefs should I have and what beliefs should I not have? And so critical thinking can in general help us evaluate whether our beliefs are rational. It helps us know when we should give up a belief, when we should keep a belief, and it also helps us just adopt better belief forming practices. So, what sources do we read? Who do we talk to about certain issues? When do we look for more evidence about something before forming a belief? And when do we not? And so, because of this, because rational believing is one of the main goals of critical thinking, this video is all about what it means for a belief to be rational. So before we talk about rational belief, I think it's good to sort of step back and think about the nature of belief in general. So first of all, note that we believe propositions. Propositions, like we talked about in the last video, are thoughts or ideas that are expressed by sentences. So when we believe something, a proposition is sort of the subject of that belief. You know, you believe it's raining, so the proposition believed is that it is raining. So when it comes to believing a certain proposition, we basically have three options, three different attitudes or stances that we can take on that proposition. We can believe it, which basically amounts to saying it's true. We can disbelieve it, which basically amounts to saying it's false. And then we can withhold belief. And that's when you say, I'm undecided on whether this is true or false. I haven't really made a commitment either way. So just think about, maybe I'll just give some examples of each of these. If the forecast predicts rain tomorrow, then I might believe that it's raining, and that it will rain tomorrow, and disbelieve that it will be sunny tomorrow. But I would withhold belief if there was like a 50-50 chance of rain. Or I would withhold belief if I flipped a fair coin, that coin would land heads. I withhold belief that there's an even number of hairs on my head. So in these cases where it could really go 50-50, it could really go either way, maybe the chances are roughly around 50-50, we usually withhold belief. So once we consider a proposition, you're going to take one, but only one of these attitudes towards it. This is a little bit controversial. Sometimes philosophers think there could be small exceptions to this, but this is at least generally true. For most propositions that we consider, we will either believe them, disbelieve them, or withhold belief on them. And note that you could believe something, but not be super confident that it's true. So maybe if there's a 70% chance of rain tomorrow, I might still believe it's going to rain tomorrow, but not be super, super confident in that. And not nearly as confident as I would be in something like 1 + 1 = 2, which I also believe. So beliefs come with varying levels of confidence. And note too, you could always change your mind. When you get new evidence or kind of consider something from a different perspective, you might go from believing to withholding or from believing to disbelieving. So just because you have one of these attitudes towards a proposition doesn't mean you can't change. And one way to think about this way of thinking about belief is you can think about believing as analogous to voting. So let's say your state is is holding a vote on whether money should be given to restore a state park. you have three choices. You can either vote yes, this money should be given. That would be kind of like believing. You can vote no, this money should not be given. That'd be kind of like disbelieving. Or you can just not vote at all. That would be like withholding belief. I know in some countries like voting is required, but let's just say you're in one of those countries where you don't have to vote on this, you don't vote at all, then you're kind of not taking a stance either way. That would be similar to like withholding belief. So in this case, when you vote yes or vote no, you're sort of taking a stand on whether money should be given. In the same way, if you believe or you disbelieve, you're sort of taking a stand, like saying this is true or this is false. And then you can refrain from voting, which is basically, again, you're not really taking a stand either way. And notice that both with the belief case and the voting case, you have to do one of these three options, and you can't do more than one of these three options. And also, what is good about this analogy with belief and voting is that even though you have to do one of these three options and you can't do more than one, that doesn't mean you can't also do other things in addition to this. You can't do other things that are relevant. So you might vote or believe really enthusiastically, yes, money should be given to the state park. Or reluctantly, you might think this is ultimately the right thing to do, but it's not. For some reason, you're reluctant about the vote. That's similar with believing as well. I might reluctantly believe it's going to rain tomorrow because I have a picnic planned, but my evidence that it's going to rain is so strong that I nonetheless believe. You might also believe, but then gather more evidence. So you might say, I'm going to, believe it's going to rain tomorrow, but I'm going to check a few other forecasts before, just to kind of make sure my belief is maximally accurate. And if those other forecasts give me additional new evidence, that could change my belief. Similar with the vote, you might vote yes, but then gather new evidence that makes you realize, actually, I shouldn't have voted that way. And, with voting, you obviously couldn't change your vote if you already voted, but you could take a different stance on how people should vote or how you would vote in the future. Okay, so this brings us to sort of our first main idea for this lecture. For every proposition that you consider, you have one of three options. Believe it, disbelieve it, withhold belief on that. Okay, so let's move on to a related topic, but slightly different, and that's how belief relates to disagreement. So one case of disagreement is a case where you believe P and I disbelieve P. So if you believe it's going to rain tomorrow and I disbelieve that it's going to rain tomorrow, then we disagree. But it's worth noting that when it comes to disagreement, sometimes we think that we disagree, but we don't actually disagree once we get clear on what the actual question is. So take this example. Has no license, can drive a car. Let's say you come up to me, has no license, is this maybe 12-year-old kid, and you say, has no license, can drive a car. And I say, what? No, he can't. Has no license, cannot drive a car. So it seems like you believe has no license, can drive a car, and I disbelieve that has no license, can drive a car. So it seems like we disagree. But the sentence is actually ambiguous because of the way that can works in English. So one proposition it might be expressing is that has no license is not allowed to drive a car because he's much too young. Another proposition it might be expressing is that has no license does not have the ability to drive a car. So in our disagreement, one of us might be saying has no license is not legally allowed to drive a car. He's too young, he doesn't have a license. And then the other one of us might be saying, no, has no license, can drive a car. He has the ability to drive a car. So we might actually agree that he does have the ability to drive a car, but he's not legally allowed to drive a car. But because the word can mean different things, ability versus like it's legal, we might think we're disagreeing, but really the sentence is just ambiguous. So I think it's important to keep this in mind when we're thinking about disagreement. So remember, a belief is true when it corresponds to the way that the world is. This doesn't matter how confident you are that the belief is true. It doesn't matter how much you want it to be true. But if I truly believe something and you truly disbelieve something, one of us is right and one of us is wrong. But the sort of lesson of this slide is that we have to really make sure that we have the same proposition in mind. If we say a sentence that's ambiguous between two things, it might seem like we're disagreeing and we're actually not. But because we say truth is this correspondence with the world, if we do have the same proposition in mind, then when we disagree, one of us is right and one of us is wrong. So as long as we're clear about the proposition, because truth is correspondence, doesn't matter how we feel about it, doesn't matter how confident we are. When we disagree, one person's right, one person's wrong. Okay, so this brings us, we've kind of talked a bit about the nature of belief and then implications that has for disagreement. This brings us to, I think, our main sort of topic or question, which is what makes a belief rational? And the main idea is that a belief is rational when it is supported by your evidence. And here's some examples that I think can show why this is in general a good principle. So my belief that there's a desk right here is rational because I have good perceptual evidence for it. I see it, I feel it, I have good evidence that it's here because of my five senses. My belief that my mom had eggs for breakfast this morning is rational because I have good testimonial evidence for it. My mom told me she had eggs and she doesn't have a reason to lie or deceive me about that. So it's a rational belief because, again, I have my mom's testimony, which is good evidence for it. But if I'm going to flip a coin, and let's say the coin has landed, but I haven't seen how it's landed. If I just decide to believe the coin landed heads because I have an intuition or a hunch, that's not rational. Because what I should do in this case is I should suspend judgment. And this principle about rational belief can tell us why. My belief that the coin landed heads isn't rational because the coin landed heads is not supported by my evidence. Instead, what's supported by my evidence is being withholding belief, not taking a stance either way until I see what the coin has landed. And if I see the coin and it has heads on top, then I have new evidence. And so the belief that the coin landed heads is supported by my evidence. So that belief is rational. So here's a huge question that is a super big topic of debate among philosophers now. Can anything besides evidence affect the rationality of belief? I have another video about this where I talk about 3 cases that it seems like maybe potentially things besides evidence could affect the rationality of belief, but I'm not going to take a stand on that here. The main thing that everyone agrees on is that evidence is one of the main factors that affects what makes a belief rational. And in general, rational belief is what is supported by your evidence, even if there could be other factors besides evidence that sometimes are at play as well. So most people closely connect rational belief and evidence, even if evidence isn't the full story. So we're just going to say a belief is rational when it is supported by our evidence, but note that that's controversial, and I'll link a video if you're interested in learning more about that controversy. Okay, so then this brings us, I think, naturally to a second question: what makes a belief irrational? And a belief is irrational when it's not supported by your evidence. So that fits very naturally with our definition of rational belief. Here are some examples of beliefs that aren't supported by your evidence. So you might make a motivational error. You might believe something because of a hope or a fear or a desire or a wish. So consider cases of wishful thinking. Maybe you believe your team is going to win the game because you want them to win the game, but that belief really isn't supported by your evidence. I said maybe I would believe that it's going to be sunny tomorrow just because I'm having a picnic tomorrow, even though the forecast really predicts rain. So sometimes we believe things because we want them to be true, even though they're not supported by our evidence, and that's irrational. You might also be paranoid. Maybe you're convinced that your partner is cheating on you, but you really don't have evidence for this. You're just sort of paranoid, and you sort of talked yourself into this, like you're really not examining your evidence carefully or properly, and you're really overthinking things. So this could be, again, a case of a belief. This would be a motivational error that's motivated by fear. You're afraid your partner's cheating on you, and so you believe it, even though it's not supported by your evidence. Another case that could make a belief irrational is when you misevaluate your evidence. So you think your evidence supports something, but it really doesn't. So you might see in a certain town an older woman wearing a red hat, and then generalize and say, then all older women in this town must wear red hats. This is maybe a little bit more of an innocent example, but some generalizations made on the basis of people's race or gender are also of this sort. So this is a case where we see one or two instances of something, and then we assume it applies to all instances of that thing. And that would be a case where your evidence actually doesn't support that general principle, but you misevaluate it and you think your evidence does. So that would also be irrational. And then finally, this is sort of related to the second one, but a case where you're not considering your total evidence. So you're trying to decide what to believe, but you're only focusing on part of your evidence, and you're forgetting that you have other evidence that's also relevant to that belief. So for example, my partner comes home for lunch almost every day at noon. And then today, I believe he's going to come home at lunch again for lunch at noon. But he also told me that he had a lunch meeting. And I forgot he had a lunch meeting, or I'm not thinking about it right now. And I believe he's going to come home for lunch today. But let's say he just told me a few hours ago, I'm not going to be home today. I have a meeting. That belief is irrational because I'm not considering my total evidence. I'm just considering part of my evidence, which is that he comes home for lunch at noon almost every day. So we need to think about all of our evidence that's relevant to some belief, not just part of it. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about what belief is in general, and then we had a little slide about disagreement, and then we've talked about what makes a belief rational and what makes a belief irrational. And now what I want to do is talk about the relationship between rationality or rational belief and truth. How do those relate to each other? Remember, in the last video, we talked about truth as correspondence to the world. So how does that idea fit with this idea that rational belief is the thing that is supported by your evidence? Well, here's what's really interesting. Rational belief and true belief are actually can actually totally come apart. So you can have rational beliefs that are false, and you can have irrational beliefs that are true. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why this is in a second, but I wanted to give some examples of each of these four cases. So a rational belief that is a true belief would be like my belief that 1 + 1 = 2. I have good evidence for it, and it is true. It corresponds to the world. You know, if I check the weather forecast and it predicts a 99% chance of rain, I have really good evidence that it rains tomorrow. And then let's say it actually does rain tomorrow. That would also be a rational belief. That's a true belief. Okay. But you can have rational beliefs that end up being false. And these are cases where you have really, really, really good evidence for something, but it ends up being misleading. So think about another sports example. Let's say two teams are going to play each other, and one team is way better than the other. We have March Madness in the US, and the teams are ranked 1 through 16, and there's almost no cases where a 16 seed beats a 1 seed. But a couple years ago, that actually happened. So let's say before that game, you believe the 1 seed is going to win. That's a rational belief because that had never happened before in the history of this tournament. But that belief actually ended up turning out to be false. So you had really good evidence the 1 seed would win, but that evidence ended up being misleading. So you can have rational beliefs that are false. Okay, you can also have irrational beliefs, beliefs not supported by your evidence, that happen to be true. And this would be a case where you just kind of get lucky. There's a lucky guess. So let's say you're trying to figure out if it's going to rain tomorrow, and you just don't even check the weather forecast, and instead you get your magic 8-ball. And you shake your magic 8-ball, and then you say, magic 8-ball, is it going to rain tomorrow? And your magic 8-ball says yes. And then let's say you got totally lucky and it does end up raining tomorrow. This would be a case where your belief that it's going to rain tomorrow is irrational because this magic 8-ball just randomly spits out answers. There's no real reliability to it at all, but the belief happens to be true. And then finally, you can have irrational beliefs that are false. So maybe a case of wishful thinking. You really want your team to win, so you believe they're going to win even though you don't have good evidence for it. And then not too much to anyone's surprise, the team ends up losing. So you can have irrational false beliefs as well. Okay, so Philosophers use the word fallibilism in different ways, but one use of the term fallibilism is this idea that you could have a rational belief that isn't a true belief. And that's because we can have really good evidence for something, even though it doesn't guarantee that that thing is true. So what we've just talked about is that a rational belief can be false, and an irrational belief can be true. So you might wonder, well, why is this? Why is this kind of fallibilism the case? And I think here's at least part of why. Rational belief depends on your evidence. It depends on the evidence that you have at a certain time. And so because of that, it is person relative, because I might have evidence that you don't have, that, a third person does or doesn't have, because we're all sort of aware of different facts. And what's interesting about this point about rational belief is that we might disagree. We might disagree on whether it's going to rain tomorrow. But that doesn't automatically mean that one of us is irrational, because we might have different evidence. Maybe you checked a different weather forecast than I did, or maybe you didn't check a forecast at all. So just because we disagree doesn't mean one of us is automatically irrational because of these differences in evidence. So what you should believe is relative to your body of evidence, not relative to someone else's body of evidence. Truth is different. Truth is not person relative, because remember, truth is correspondence to the world. So truth depends on the way the world is. So if we disagree about whether it's going to rain tomorrow, one of us is right and one of us is wrong. This is different than rationality. If I say, yes, it's going to rain, and you say, no, it's not going to rain, well, one of those propositions is true and one of those propositions is false. So we could both be rational because we have different evidence, but we both can't be right. One of our beliefs is true, one of our beliefs is not true. So rationality is relative to your evidence, truth is not. And I think because rationality is person relative and truth is not, this can help us understand why we can have rational false beliefs and irrational true beliefs. Sometimes we have evidence that's misleading, and we have good reason to think that the world is a certain way when it's actually not. And sometimes we get lucky and we decide to believe something even though we don't have good evidence for it, and then the world just ends up being that way. So because rationality is person relative and truth is not, this is why we can have rational false beliefs and irrational true beliefs. Okay, I know that was probably a lot, but I wanted to just briefly touch on a bonus topic, and that is knowledge. So we've been talking a lot about rational belief, we've been talking a lot about truth, but what does this have to do with knowing something, knowing that a proposition is true? And what's interesting is that so far in this lecture, and I guess the previous video as well, we've discussed 3 out of the 4 components of knowledge. So knowledge involves belief. When you know something, you believe that it's true. Knowledge involves truth, because if you know something, it has to be true. I can't know it's going to rain tomorrow if it doesn't rain tomorrow. And knowledge involves rationality or justification, which we've understood in terms of good evidence. So you can't know something if you don't have good evidence for it. So if Sarah knows it's raining, here's just an example. She believes it's raining. Her belief that it's raining is rational or justified, and it is actually raining. So you need all 3 of these components in order to know something. Another complication we're not going to get into today is that most epistemologists, which are people that study knowledge and rational belief, they think you need at least one more component to knowledge. So we're not going to talk about this here, but I'll link another video in the description if you're interested in what that 4th component might be. But what's worth noting is that we've talked about at least 3 of the things you need to know something. You need to believe it, it needs to be true, and that belief needs to be rational or justified. So we're well on our way to knowing stuff, which I think is kind of fun. Okay, so this is what we've covered today. We've talked about critical thinking and rational belief, and why believing rationally is one of the important goals of thinking critically. We've talked about the 3 belief attitudes you can take towards a proposition. You can believe it, you can disbelieve it, and you can withhold belief on it. We've talked about belief and disagreement, and how we disagree when you believe something and I disbelieve it, but also how we have to get really clear on the proposition in question, because we might think we disagree when we actually don't disagree. The sentence we're talking about is ambiguous. And then we've talked about rational and irrational belief. Rational belief is supported by your evidence. Irrational belief is not supported by your evidence. And then we've talked about the relationship between rationality and truth and how they can actually come apart in several ways. And then we've basically done a little bit about knowledge and talked about 3 of the 4 components of knowledge. So here's a couple key lessons. For each proposition you consider, you can believe it, withhold belief on it, or disbelieve it. Rational belief is supported by your evidence, and irrational belief is not supported by your evidence. And rational belief is not the same thing as true belief. You can have irrational true beliefs and rational false beliefs. Much of the content from this lecture is taken from Feldman's Reason and Argument, Chapter 2.